Hello. I am also giving another quick take right now about a topic that I covered to some degree a couple weeks ago, which was Keith Ellison and the issue of whether he should be the Democratic Party's deputy chair, and all of the real evidence that's been building up that this guy is pretty much you know a lunatic and kind of um, somebody that's lost all shame as far as what he believes in. Now, I'd say that there are certain core principles that he does believe in. First of all, that he is some sort of new Malcolm X, okay, which he's not. Malcolm X was a real leader with real principles. I don't agree with all those principles, obviously. I don't see why we have to always say that, but I guess we do now. But Malcolm X was a great leader, by the way. Somebody who was able to withstand pressure within the Nation of Islam, but also from the white media, and also from liberals, and also from conservatives. And he ended up becoming, before he was killed, really one of the most important figures of the 20th century, because he was willing to take a lot of the heat for saying things that obviously we're not very touchy feely and affectionate towards everybody. He said some honest things about race relations in the United States in the 1960s. In the 1960s, Keith Ellison believes that he's pretty much the reincarnation of Malcolm X, but as a Democratic Party operative in 21st century Minnesota. 21st century Minnesota is not anything like 1960s Northern America, urban America, New York City and whatever. I mean, maybe there's certain residual issues of racism between people. I haven't been to Minnesota, but it actually strikes me as one of the more unracist states, if I could put it that way. It also strikes me as kind of a state. I know people say that there's this whole thing, Minnesota nice, which is like people are nice on the outside, but really don't want to get to know you. Well, that's a characteristic of all the people of Minnesota, Keith Ellison. Now, the reason I'm talking about that is not because of anything particular that's gone on with regard to him in Minnesota lately. There was a video, and I'm going to post the link later in this description, where Mr. Ellison, the congressman from Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and also he happens to be the deputy DNC chair. He starts berating the chairman of the Fed, the Federal Reserve, about the impact of 700,000 workers being removed from the American economy. That's not what the Fed does, you idiot. That's a question for the Secretary of Labor. That's a secretary for the Treasury, maybe. Okay, when you talk to that, and I actually called Rethinking the Dollar yesterday, who shared that video. Who, by the way, check out my chat from last week with him. Probably one of the best YouTube channels out there for just information without political bias. Okay, there's a guy who's not political, and he just put up the raw tape of Ellison just berating the head of the chairman of the Fed, alongside another guy who, Al Green, berating the chairman of the Fed with regards to full employment, claiming that the last time there was full employment was in the black community was during slavery. These are the people that are here to represent the black community. I'm sorry, but if that's the case, then the black community has done itself a disservice. They've gone and elected people that are not going to get anything done for them, because there's nothing that the chairman of the Federal Reserve can do to impact immigration policy. Maybe if he has some sort of power behind the scenes that they don't know, that they know about and they're not telling us about, maybe then you can make the argument that it's a relevant discussion to have with him. But officially on the level, no. And I'll turn you to this article from Mother Jones, which says Keith Ellison is everything Republicans thought Obama was. Maybe he's just what Democrats need. and I'll try to read through it as quick as I can. By the way, this video I'm hoping will be automatically shared on Bitchute, and I think I already have the link to my new Bitchute in the. It's not that new. I just haven't used it in the description. So please start watching me on Bitchute as well if you have a Bitchute account. I know I've had a couple. I don't have that many subscribers, but a couple of them have asked about it. So it says last May, as Donald Trump was locking up the Republican nomination, a prophetic clip began circulating among portions of the left. It was a nearly one-year-old segment of ABC's Sunday show this week featuring Representative Keith Ellison, the Minnesota Democrat, then on the verge of winning a sixth term. Anybody from the Democratic side of the fence who's terrified of the possibility of a President Trump better vote, better get active, better get involved, Ellison warned, because this man has got some momentum and we better be ready for the fact that he might be leading the Republican ticket. And then, you start. This is in reference to one clip where Ellison actually predicted that Donald Trump could get elected, and that was a moment of honesty, a rare moment of honesty for him. So it says now Trump is President Ellison, who saw it coming, is after a new job running the Democratic Party. So this was before last year's DNC election. He announced his candidacy for Democratic National Committee chair in mid-November, and he and former Labor Secretary Tom Perez are the front runners for the position, which are nearly so. Blah blah blah. We already know that Tom Perez ended up winning. Ellison, an early and vocal supporter of Bernie Sanders, who campaigned hard for Hillary Clinton last fall, is running to unify a fragmented party. Sanders backs him. So do Senators Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer, the Democratic minority leader. So does the AFL-CIO. Win or lose, the 53-year-old Ellison, a Muslim African-American co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, is poised to hold a position of influence in the party during one of the darkest moments in its history. Democrats are out of the White House and in the minority in Congress, and they've lost their window to reshape the Supreme Court. They control both the governor's mansion and legislature in just 6 states with another round of redistricting. So some of this has already changed. So, they go through his background. So, some of this, go read this. I have the archived link. It says here, Republicans are eager to take him on because in many ways the story of Keith Ellison is a story conservatives wanted to believe about another cerebral African-American community organizer from the Midwest, Barack Obama. Raised Catholic in Detroit, Ellison converted to Islam, dabbled in black nationalism, and marched with the Nation of Islam's Louis Farrakhan, all before his first bid for Congress in 2006. His past dogged him in that run and has continued to be an issue in the DNC race. Billionaire Haim Saban, one of the Democrats' biggest donors, who's out of his friggin' mind too, for unrelated reasons, has trashed him as an anti-Semite. As a young activist in Minneapolis, Ellison learned to build coalitions outside the scope of party politics. He also learned the limits of what such activism could achieve without political power. For Ellison, it was a time of experimentation, education, and sometimes radical dalliances that ultimately imbued his politics a hard-edged pragmatism. Many Democrats underestimated the extent to which Trump's religious intolerance and ravings about inner cities would appeal to broad, largely white swaths of the electorate. They banked on the arc of progress to knock him back. Ellison, who built his career battling racist institutions, knew better than to make that mistake. So Ellison was the third of 5 boys raised in a big brick house in a mixed-race enclave of Detroit known as Palmer Woods. His father, Leonard Ellison Sr., was a psychiatrist, an atheist, and a hard-ass who quizzed his sons on current events and drove them to Gettysburg to walk the battlefield every Easter. Leonard was a Republican, not an activist. While he once helped to integrate a sailboat race run by, so this is already debunking Ellison's bullshit Democratic. I mean, they're basically giving away the game because his dad, who was black, was a Republican. He helped integrate a sailboat race run by an all-white Detroit yacht club. So he wasn't exactly dirt poor, because who participates in a yacht club? Not poor people. He mostly believed in nudging a racist system through relentless achievement. The Ellison boys were expected to become either doctors or lawyers. They all did. If his trajectory was ordained by his father, Ellison's worldview bore the imprint of his mother, Cleta, a devout Catholic from a Louisiana Creole family. The congressman's maternal grandfather was a voting rights organizer in Nacogdoches. I think they misspelled Nacogdoches, but whatever. Cleta was sent to a boarding school for safety. The Ku Klux Klan once burned a cross outside their house. Cleta's family tree, with roots in the Balkans, France, Spain, and West Africa, was a prism for understanding the absurdity of the South's racial caste system. Ellison's younger brother, Anthony, now a lawyer in Boston, recalled Ellison struggling with their mother's revelation that some of their Creole ancestors had owned slaves. Oh, I guess he's complicit in some way then. During visits to a family cotton farm in Louisiana, Ellison brought notebooks and a tape recorder and spent hours interviewing relatives. Ellison's political awakening, which he credits to reading the autobiography of Malcolm X at age 13. That's actually the age I read that book, which, by the way, it is a fantastic book. But so here we start to get to how he basically became a wacko. Came during a period, which is not Malcolm X's fault, by the way. Came during a period of racial turmoil in Detroit. When riots started after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Ellison, then 5, hid under his bed as National Guard personnel carriers cruised past his block. Over a 2.5-year period in the early 1970s, one Detroit police unit that formed after the riots was accused of killing 21 African Americans. Ellison feared crime and the people tasked with stopping it. After graduating from high school in 1981, he majored in economics at nearby Wayne State University, moving out of his leafy neighborhood and into a one-bedroom apartment in the city's crack-ravaged Cass corridor. So he did get to have a little taste of the inner city. Ellison's first brush with controversy came a few months into his freshman year. After joining the student newspaper of the South End, he persuaded the editor to publish a cartoon featuring 5 identical black men dribbling a basketball alongside a man in a Klan robe who was clutching a club. Above it was a question: how many honkies are in this picture? It was meant to poke fun at racial caricatures, but students didn't see the humor. And African American, so I don't really understand what this means either. It was meant to poke fun at racial caricatures, but students didn't see the humor. An African American classmate stormed into the newspaper's office to confront him, a scene Ellison breezily recounted in a follow-up column mocking the outcry. His critics were still living in the Jim Crow era. No, we're living in the "what the fuck are you talking about" era. That's what I would call it, Ellison wrote. The firestorm made the pages of the Detroit Free Press. In the months to follow, friends noticed a change in Ellison. He seemed to be a little more introspective, a little more circumspect, says Mary Chapman, a Detroit writer who worked on the South End. Maybe he grew up, or maybe he found religion. Ellison had drifted from his mother's Catholic church, but it had left a void. In his 2014 memoir, My Country, 'Tis of Thee, Ellison writes that he began attending a mosque when he was 19, drawn by a billboard he passed on his commute. Cleta Ellison described the reveal as more confusing than shocking. He announced one day that he was going to mosque. He said, "My question was, what's mosque?" Increasingly, he devoted his energy to anti-apartheid activism, and his columns took on a new urgency. When Bernie Goetz was acquitted of attempted murder after shooting 4 black men on a New York subway, Ellison warned it won't be long before police officers, old ladies, weekend survival gamers, and everyone else considers the open season on the brothers. Well, remember that incident. I believe that the evidence showed that it was 4 black men who surrounded this guy on the subway in the 1980s, when New York subway was basically a free for all. There were people getting. This was the era that up until Giuliani became mayor, that New York had inspired films like what's that one? Death Wish, the original Death Wish, the awesome one. I don't know yet about the Bruce Willis one. We'll see. But so there's Death Wish. There was Wild Style. And then there was The Warriors, which is another classic, which is all about gangs, and conspicuously a lot of them white. But in reality, I don't think that many of the gangs in the 80s were exclusively white gangs in New York. A lot of the gangs happen to be from minority areas. And I think that the blame for that was the liberal rot that led them to basically live an aimless life. And instead, they want to blame some dude, this middle-aged guy, Bernhard Goetz, who was on the subway. I think he was like just some white dude, and he shoots four guys who ganged up on him in the subway. So what are you going to say that oh four guys go walk up to you on the subway, you should probably just give them all your money. Okay, that's not the. And by the way, I think all four of them, I think two of them admitted that they were going to rob him or something, but I could be wrong. But I remember there was there was clear revelations in the case that these people did have malicious intent. Increasingly, he devoted his energy to. So I read this paragraph already. He read a lot of Frantz Fanon, the Marxist anti-colonialist writer from Martinique, and in 1985 he attended a campus speech by Louis Farrakhan, the controversial Nation of Islam leader who blended calls for black empowerment with lengthy diatribes against Jews, gays, and other groups. So, for those of you that don't know the contradiction, when Malcolm X broke with the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan called him a traitor. So anybody that, like, let's say you have Louis Farrakhan of today explaining that his inspiration during his youth came from Malcolm X, that would automatically be nullified by joining Louis Farrakhan, who, by the way, was much more of a bigot than Malcolm X ever was. It still is, and again, freedom of speech entitles both of them, Louis Farrakhan and Malcolm X, to believe in whatever they want and say whatever they want. But but it doesn't mean that you can't point out the contradiction for somebody to support both of them. It really is an either or proposition, because in many circles, Louis Farrakhan is considered one of the people responsible for Malcolm X's murder, along with the FBI, by the way. So let's not let the federal government off the hook, because I think one of the suspects was, or one of the people that was convicted, I think they were convicted, was an FBI informant. But there was an era of experimentation to everything he did. In high school, Ellison had formed a short-lived ska and thrash metal band called the Deviants. Nice, pretty good. Now Ellison would fiddle with his guitar, incessantly studying different variations of Johnny B. Good. There so many Democrats view so it's not like this guy is a total waste of humanity, but he's full of himself. He's full of shit. He doesn't know how to he doesn't know how to reconcile the contradiction between supporting Malcolm X and supporting Louis Farrakhan. Many Democrats view Ellison as the kind of organizer the movement demands, capable of harnessing the resurgent movements of the left, racial justice, and economic populism. But critics have flogged the constant and consistent narrative about his past, one that has haunted him since his first run for Congress in 2006. The case against Ellison has its roots in his time at the University of Minnesota Law School, where he began making a name for himself as a fierce critic of police and a Farrakhan defender. It was a radical identity he outgrew, one that friends insist doesn't represent the Ellison of today, but one that fundamentally changed his idea of how politics worked. So then it goes through, let me see here. He goes, I'm not going to read the whole thing because I do have to go, but in the hopes of mending fences, the university organized a series of conversations between black students and Jewish groups. Ellison could be deferential at these meetings. He thanked Jewish students for sticking up for black students' right to host controversial campus speakers, even if they had denounced those speakers, and suggested working together on common political causes. But he also insisted the charges that Toure was racist were unfounded. So he's talking about Kwame Toure, the former Black Panther Stokely Carmichael, who did become very anti-white racist and anti-Jewish racist later in his life, and he had accomplishments in the Black Panthers, and many of you probably wouldn't want me to call those accomplishments, but ultimately he went the way of Farrakhan. Michael Olnick, a Jewish student who clashed with Ellison and who was the opinions editor at the Daily, I think it was the Daily Gopher in Minnesota, but I could be wrong, recalled Ellison maintaining that an oppressed group could not be racist towards Jews because Jews were themselves oppressors. European white Jews are trying to oppress minorities all over the world, Olnick remembers Ellison arguing. Keith would go on all the time about Jewish slave traders. So okay, are you going to believe Keith Ellison? who has lied repeatedly about his association with Farrakhan, or people that knew him personally. That's up to you. I would actually believe, and I've said that in previous videos, that I would believe Louis Farrakhan before I believed Keith Ellison, because Farrakhan is at least honest about who he is and what he believes. Ellison isn't. He's all over the place. Another Jewish student active in progressive politics recalled Ellison's incredulous response to the controversy over Zionism. What are you afraid of? Ellison asked. Do you think black nationalists are going to get power and hurt Jews? Ellison rejected allegations of anti-Semitism. I've always lived a politics defined by respecting differences, rejecting all forms of racism and anti-Semitism, he wrote recently. He declined to be interviewed for the story, and his office did not respond to detailed questions from Mother Jones. So this guy who is supposed to be the head of the Democratic Party going ahead, and they write this piece where at some points they basically kiss his ass. He wouldn't even interview with them because he doesn't want them to dabble in to dive into his real history. At law school, Ellison was already laying a foundation for his shift to politics. He was becoming known as an organizer with a flair for publicity. At the beginning of 1989, two incidents solidified his growing reputation. On January 25th, as part of a series of raids on suspected crack storehouses, police tossed a stun grenade through the window of an apartment building in North Minneapolis. Two elderly black residents died in the resulting blaze. No drugs were found, and none of the men arrested in the building were subsequently charged. A grand jury declined to indict the offending officers. So, okay, that's an interesting case. Ellison and a few students organized a protest over the lack of prosecutions, but the day before their rally, another incident happened at the downtown Embassy Suites. The hotel was a hangout spot for college students, and on that night, two parties were happening on the same floor. One was a kegger hosted by a group of white students. The other was a birthday party attended by African American students. It was a low-key gathering. One woman had brought her toddler, but when police responded to a noise complaint about the kegger, they busted up the birthday instead. Party goers alleged that cops called them the N-word. One student at the party, Daily Reporter named Van Hayden, told me an officer had dangled him over the edge of the sixth floor railing. He left in handcuffs. So these are interesting incidents. I think this is from like 1989, and it could have been a real I think both of those incidents are worth exploring. I don't know much about them, so I'm not going to say whether it was a good idea for him to act for it or not. Ellison and his chief collaborator, an undergraduate named Chris Nissan, who was active with the Socialist Workers' Party, attracted the attention of Forward Motion, a small socialist journal. Their interview ran with a photo of Ellison clutching a megaphone, a headband wrapped around his forehead. People are coming face to face with their own oppression, Ellison said. He was alarmed by the rise of white supremacist David Duke. Again, Duke barely did anything important. He got elected to a state assembly seat in Louisiana in the 80s. That's about it. 8 years of mean-spiritedness of the Reagan era have encouraged fascist and racist forces to come out again. A Ku Kluxer was just elected in Louisiana. We see a rise in police brutality all over the country. By the way, Reagan and his administration renounced. I remember reading about this. They renounced David Duke even when he won the nomination for the seat. It was in Metairie, Louisiana. They don't include that here. So they don't talk about the fact that he was renounced under Reagan, just like the fact that they don't give credit when Duke was renounced by the Trump campaign. Ellison envisioned a unified front of young black people, white progressive students, organized labor, and American Indians pushing back against the evils of. I don't think he included women and transgenders and gays, but maybe he wasn't progressive enough at the time. The more the right attacks, the more we will have to respond, he said. Ellison and Nissan's protest did win a victory, albeit a limited one. 4 of the 5 students arrested at the hotel were acquitted of their misdemeanor charges, and Minneapolis set up an independent, if weak, review board to investigate police brutality claims. In 1990, Ellison helped launch the Coalition for Police Accountability, which organized community meetings and published a quarterly newspaper, Cop Watch. As the city's crime rate soared in the early 90s, I wonder why. Some residents took to calling it Murderapolis. Black residents found themselves in the crosshairs of anti-crime initiatives and city politics. Ellison was still leading protests against the police, but he was not just on the outside. 2 years out of law school, he ran for a seat on a city commission that controlled $400 million in development funding. Ellison's slate stunned observers with its organization, bringing in 3 busloads of Hmong residents, so among HMONG, to vote in a race few people knew existed. So he was already doing, like, vote organizing or whatever. I wonder what those Hmong residents got for it, because it doesn't seem he really represents the Hmong today. I'm not saying that he bribed them, but I wonder what they got out of it. Around this time, Ellison began attending a book club led by a prominent history professor at Macalester College who placed an emphasis on reclamation, the idea that whatever gains African Americans made would have to come through their own efforts. The same way that our ancestors laid something down for us, we got to lay something down for the people who come next, is how Resma Menachem, a friend of Ellison's who was what is he, a Chabad African American? That's an inside joke. Menachem is a common Jewish name, by the way, for those of you that don't get the joke. It's like probably as common as it gets. A friend of Ellison's, who was also in the club, described the theme. In practice, this meant building institutions, school. I wonder if there's a Menachem watching right now. Schools, civic groups, nonprofits capable of boosting and protecting the community. During Black History Month in 1993, Menachem and Ellison guest hosted a segment on the Black community radio station KMOG about James Baldwin and Malcolm X. So again, Malcolm X or Louis Farrakhan. You got to pick one of them. It evolved into a weekly show called Black Power Perspectives that lasted for 8 years. The callers forced Ellison to think and argue on his feet, and at times keep his emotions in check. Islam was a particularly volatile subject. White supremacists frequently called in, and Ellison once got so agitated he had to leave the studio. Yeah, well, keep a lid on it. In 1993, after a pit stop at a white shoe law firm, Ellison landed a job as executive director of the Legal Rights Center, a nonprofit focused on providing indigent defense in the city's African American, Hmong, and American Indian communities. One of the group's founders represented Russell Means and Dennis Banks after their 1973 standoff at Wounded Knee. So basically, maybe we'll do another one of these. I do have to go, but this article, it just keeps going on and on and on, and looking favorably about things that the left should love about Ellison, but that he can't admit to. And if he goes out in public and talks about this, he basically, he can play to the people that were supporters of his back in the day, but on the national level, people look at him and they're like, this guy's a Fruit Loop. This is exactly the reason I got the inspiration to actually talk about this today was I'm reading Bernard Goldberg, yes, one of those parenthesis people that some of you like to make fun of, but Bernard Goldberg is a guy, used to be a liberal reporter back in the 90s for CBS News. He wrote a book called A Slobbering Love Affair, the true and pathetic story of the torrid romance between Barack Obama and the mainstream media. I'll show you it for a second. And I actually picked it up in the library, but here it is on Amazon. And it talks about how people had the information about Barack Obama's ties to Reverend Jeremiah Wright's church in Chicago, and they basically mirror everything that Louis Farrakhan was. Not Louis Farrakhan, but Reverend Wright is basically the Black Christian version of Louis Farrakhan, a very anti-white, also anti-Jewish. I think he was also anti-gay pastor in Chicago. And it's the same thing with Keith Ellison. And for Keith Ellison to, run away from his past consistently, and people to say, oh, well, this isn't really relevant today. Bullshit, it isn't relevant today. If this was anybody on the other side of the fence, they wouldn't they won't look at it so tolerantly. If this was, for example, Ted Cruz, he had a pastor who was accused of being an anti-Semite. You had people like You could talk about Rick Perry. You could talk about Mike Pence. All the time they talk about how Mike Pence is a religious fanatic. Well, look at Keith Ellison. Everything that Keith, and this is not, this is the same as with Barack Obama. Mother Jones even says that everything that the right said about that the right was wrong about with Barack Obama, they might be right about with Keith Ellison, and they consider it a good thing. That's false. Everything that the right said, I wouldn't say everything, but a lot of the things that the right said about Barack Obama back in 2008 or so, is has pretty much been validated. Okay, all of the stuff about his radical agenda and his belief system and his hatred of the police and his association with Reverend Wright, and now the revelation that he had meetings with Farrakhan, which again I've said before, I have no problem with people meeting with Louis Farrakhan or or saying that they agree with Louis Farrakhan. Then you have to kind of defend that position on its own merits. Okay, that doesn't mean that you can say, oh, you support Farrakhan, we don't have to listen to you. Well, what's the problem with supporting Farrakhan? The issue here is honesty, and for people like Dershowitz, Alan Dershowitz, who I continually say is he calls himself a true Democrat and a liberal and whatever. He said that if Ellison was elected, he would leave the Democratic Party. It was the most empty threat that there was. Ellison was not elected, but he was chosen to be deputy chair. He continues to represent the Democrats on many levels, and especially in Congress. Okay, especially and as a senior member of the congressional Black Caucus and the congressional and the Democratic Caucus in Congress. He is as much a member of the Democratic establishment now as anybody else. He's raising donor money. Maybe he doesn't have decisional power the way that his supporters would have liked as the deputy chair, but I don't think that's really why he was in it. I think he was in it in order to acquire more and more influence and notoriety. And Alan Dershowitz should have come, if he really wanted to show that he's a man, should have come through on his threat. I know a lot of people respect him. There are certain things that I respect him for, but not this. This guy, Alan Dershowitz, is full of himself, and both him and Ellison, in my opinion, are dishonest about their position as far as Keith Ellison and what it means to be a Democrat. If the Democrats want somebody like Keith Ellison to represent them, I think that's a more honest picture of what the Democrats are today. Dishonest, identity politics obsessed, weirdos that don't know anything about the Constitution or about civil liberties. So that's about it for today. And perhaps there will be a live stream later. By the way, this might be going up automatically on Bitchute. We'll see what happens. And comment and share this video, and subscribe if you haven't already.